My boss always called me ugly and shames me in front of our colleagues. So at the company gala, I made sure he wouldn't take his eyes off of me. The first time it happened, I was walking into a client meeting and he stopped me at the door and told me to let Kirk take the lead because, and I'm quoting him exactly, some faces aren't built for the front of the room. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He moved me off client-facing work that same month. I did the research, built the proposals, ran the numbers, put together every single pitch deck that landed us new business, and then Kirk or Deborah or whoever Raymond decided was presentable enough would walk into the room and deliver my work with their face attached to it. At team lunches, he made little remarks. Once I wore a new blouse and he looked at me and asked who I was trying to impress because it wasn't working. At a birthday party, he told a story about a roommate's dog that was so ugly it had charm, and then looked right at me and said some things just grow on you. Everyone laughed. He said it like a compliment. I filed 2 complaints in the first year. Both times I sat across from a woman named Audrey in HR who nodded very seriously, wrote things down in a notebook, and then nothing happened. Raymond got a talking to once. He came back from that meeting, sat on the edge of my desk, and told me he was sorry if I was sensitive, but that he was just being honest, and honesty shouldn't be punishable. After that, he got smarter about it. He stopped saying things in front of groups and started doing it when it was just us, or just one other person who wouldn't back me up. He'd catch me in the break room and say I should smile more because I needed all the help I could get. He'd see me eating lunch at my desk and ask if I'd considered that maybe my diet was why I looked the way I did. 2 years of that, every single week. And the worst part was that other people in the office started treating me like I really was the person he described. I'd suggest an idea in a meeting and it would get picked up only after someone else repeated it. He had built a version of me that everyone believed, and I had to walk around inside of it every day. I started dressing down because what was the point? I stopped raising my hand in meetings because the air would go out of the room the second I started talking. Like everyone was already half listening for whoever would say it next. Louder and prettier and worth hearing. I started eating lunch at my desk because the break room was Raymond's hunting ground, and I couldn't sit through another comment about my face dressed up as friendly advice. There were mornings I'd sit in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going in, gripping the steering wheel and counting to 100, telling myself it was a paycheck and I needed it and I could take one more day. Then came the annual company gala. Our firm throws it every December at a hotel ballroom downtown, full bar, seated dinner, live band, spouses come, the CEO comes, regional directors fly in. I'd skipped it the last 2 years because Raymond had made a comment about how the gala was for people who represent the brand, and I took the hint. But this year was different. This year Raymond's wife Lorraine was coming. I knew because Deborah mentioned it at lunch, said Lorraine had already picked out her dress. That detail mattered because I'd met Lorraine once at a company picnic, and I remembered 2 things about her. She watched Raymond like a hawk around other women, and she had a temper that made Raymond look like a librarian. So I went. I spent $600 on a dress, which was more than I'd spent on clothing in the entire previous year. I got my hair done. I had a friend who did makeup for weddings and she spent 2 hours on me. I didn't do this because I believed Raymond's version of me. I did it because I knew exactly what would happen when I walked into that room looking the way I knew I could look, and I knew exactly who would be watching. I'd been carrying a version of his face in my head for 2 years. The smirk he made when he said the thing about my blouse, the way his eyes never quite met mine when he was pretending I wasn't there, and I wanted to put something in front of that face that he couldn't ignore, not for me, for Lorraine, so that the next time he opened his mouth at home about how lucky she was, she'd have one image she couldn't shake. I arrived 40 minutes late on purpose. The room was already full, the bar was flowing, people were loose. I walked in and watched it happen in real time. Heads turning, double takes, coworkers who hadn't looked at me in months suddenly finding things to say. Kirk spilled his drink. The HR director, who'd nodded politely past me for 2 years like I was a piece of office furniture, came up and asked if I'd ever thought about moving into client relations. A regional VP I'd never spoken to introduced himself twice in the same conversation because he forgot the first time. Deborah walked over and put a hand on my arm and said something quiet I couldn't quite hear over the band, and she was smiling, but her eyes were wet at the corners, like she'd seen something she'd been waiting to see for a long time. But the only reaction I cared about was Raymond's. He was standing by the bar with Lorraine when I came in. He saw me from across the room and his entire posture changed. He stood up straighter, he adjusted his tie, and then for the next 90 minutes he could not leave me alone. He came over 3 separate times. The first time he said I looked incredible and asked if I'd done something different. I said nope, same face. He didn't catch it. The second time he brought me a drink I hadn't asked for and stood too close and told me I should come to client dinners more often. I told him I thought some faces weren't built for the front of the room. He laughed nervously and told me to stop being modest. The third time was when Lorraine noticed. He'd left her at their table to come tell me how I was the most impressive person in the department, and that he'd always said so. Lorraine walked up behind him and heard every word. Raymond froze. Lorraine looked at me and asked if her husband always talked to me this way at work. I said no. I said at work he usually tells me I'm too ugly to put in front of clients. Lorraine's face went through about 6 different expressions in 3 seconds, and none of them were good for Raymond. She picked up her clutch and walked out of the ballroom. Raymond went after her. I went back to the bar. Monday morning, I knew something was wrong before I got to my desk. The whole floor had this weird energy, like when you walk into a room and everyone just stopped talking about you. Kirk walked right past my cubicle without stopping, which doesn't sound like much except Kirk had stopped at my desk every single morning for 2 years. He didn't even look at me. I sat down, opened my laptop, and there it was. A meeting request from Audrey in HR, marked urgent, scheduled for 10 a.m. No subject line, no description, just a blank invite with a red exclamation point next to it. I'd been in that office 2 years and I'd never gotten a meeting request from Audrey she hadn't explained first. I found out fast. The first thing was that Raymond got to HR before I did. He filed a formal complaint against me over the weekend. According to what I eventually learned, his complaint said I showed up to the gala dressed in a way meant to be provocative, that I made inappropriate comments to him throughout the evening, that I deliberately tried to humiliate him in front of his spouse as part of an ongoing pattern of behavior. In his version, I was the predator. He was the victim. He put it all in writing with his name on it before I even woke up Sunday morning. The second thing came from Deborah in the break room. She told me Lorraine had packed a bag and gone to her sisters. She told me Raymond was already in his office on the phone, begging, telling Lorraine I'd been flirting with him at work for a year, that I'd worn that dress for him. This man, who had spent 2 years calling me ugly to my face, was now telling his wife I was obsessed with him. The third thing I found when I tried to pull up a file: every folder on the shared project drive, every pitch deck, every proposal, every research document I'd built over 2 years was locked behind a permission wall. I couldn't open any of it. I checked the notification log. Raymond had revoked my access at 11:47 p.m. on Sunday night, hours after Lorraine walked out, hours before he filed the complaint. Without those files, I couldn't prove I'd built anything. My name wasn't on the final versions because Raymond always had someone else put their name on them before they went out. The only proof I had was on that drive, in the version history, in the original uploads with my user ID and my timestamps. And now I couldn't touch any of it. I sat at my desk and I could feel the shape of what Raymond was doing. He wasn't just covering for the gala. He was trying to erase me. He was building a version of events where I was the crazy woman who showed up to a work event to seduce her married boss, where my work belonged to everyone but me, and where there was no evidence to prove otherwise. He'd filed the complaint to make me the aggressor. He'd lied to Lorraine to keep his marriage from being proof of his character. And he'd locked the drive to make sure I walked into that HR meeting with nothing but my word against his. I had 48 minutes before I sat across from Audrey again. I picked up my phone and called my friend Rex. He asked if there was anywhere else my work was saved, anywhere Raymond couldn't touch. And that's when I remembered. When I first started, I used to email myself copies of finished decks as personal backups, in case I ever looked for another job. I pulled up my sent folder while Rex was still on the line, and there they were. Dozens of emails to myself with subject lines like, final deck for client presentation, everyone with an attached file and a timestamp that showed exactly when I sent it, weeks or sometimes months before Kirk or Deborah ever stood up in a meeting and delivered it. Raymond could lock the shared drive all he wanted. He couldn't get into my personal email. He couldn't delete messages I sent to myself from my own account. Rex was still on the phone, and I could hear him breathing, waiting. And when I told him what I was looking at, he said, the way only Rex could say a thing like it was the most obvious sentence in the world, that Raymond had built his lie on the idea that I had nothing. I had everything. Now use it. Then I remembered something else. 8 months ago, I was heating up my lunch in the break room. Raymond walked in and leaned against the counter and told me I should smile more because I needed all the help I could get. Same thing he always said. What I didn't know at the time was that Ruben from IT was crouched down behind the vending machine fixing the coin mechanism, completely out of sight. Raymond had no idea he was there. I only found out 2 days later when Ruben came up to me and asked if I was doing okay, with this look like he wanted to say more but didn't. I texted Ruben from my desk. I asked if he remembered being in the break room 8 months ago when Raymond said something to me. He responded in less than 3 minutes. 3. I had stared at my screen counting the seconds, and 3 minutes was all it took. I remember every word. I should have said something then. I'll say it now. I read that text 4 times. I'd been alone in that office for 2 years, walking past people who saw the way Raymond talked to me and decided it was none of their business, and now one of them was finally saying out loud what he'd been carrying. It wasn't enough to undo what had been done, but it was a person, naming it. That was more than I'd had since I walked in the door. Then Deborah came back to my desk. She told me Raymond had pressured Kirk to back his story, that I'd been acting weird, showing up at his office, fixated on him. She told me Kirk hadn't said no, so I asked Deborah straight. Would she tell HR the truth about who actually built those presentations? She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. I'm tired of pretending I don't see what he does. Her voice was quiet but steady, and I believed her. She stood up and touched my shoulder on her way out, just a quick squeeze, and then she was gone. I knew what it had cost her to walk over to my desk twice that morning, knowing Raymond could see her from his office door. 2 people willing to stand up. That was 2 more than I had ever had before. I forwarded every self-emailed deck into a new folder and labeled each one with the date and the project name. Some of them went back 18 months. Some of them were for projects that ended up landing 6-figure accounts. Projects Kirk had walked into a boardroom and presented with his name on the cover slide, while I sat at my desk and watched the meeting happen through the glass conference room wall. I printed everything. Every time-stamped email, every screenshot of the permission revoke log, a written timeline of 2 years of comments with dates and locations where I could remember them. I put it all in a folder and held it in my lap like a shield. Ruben sent me a written statement from his personal email before the meeting even started. I walked into that conference room at exactly 10 a.m. and knew immediately something had changed. Audrey wasn't alone. There was a man next to her I'd never seen before. Mid-50s, gray suit, expensive watch, the kind of calm that comes from authority you don't have to prove. Audrey introduced him as Vincent, a senior director from the regional office who'd flown in that morning. Raymond's complaint hadn't just been taken seriously, it had been escalated. Vincent told me they'd already received a detailed written statement from Raymond and had spoken with 2 colleagues who corroborated his account. 2 colleagues. Kirk was one. I didn't know who the second was. Vincent asked for my version of events. I opened the folder. I laid the time-stamped emails on the table. 18 months of files I'd built that someone else had delivered. I showed him the dates, the subject lines, the attachments. I showed him how every single one was created weeks before the final presentation date, and how every final version had someone else's name on the cover slide. Kirk's, Deborah's, never mine. Vincent picked up the first few pages and actually read them, line by line, checking timestamps. Then I pulled out the screenshots of the drive notification log. I showed him the exact moment Raymond revoked my access at 11:47 p.m. on Sunday night, hours before he filed the formal complaint against me. I watched Vincent's jaw tighten just slightly, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. Audrey was sitting perfectly still with her pen in her hand, and hadn't written a single thing since I started talking. Her eyes kept moving between the papers on the table and the wall behind my head, like she was trying to look at anything except what was right in front of her. She looked like someone watching a house they built start to fall apart. I'd seen that look on her face once before, 2 years ago, after my second complaint, when she told me Raymond was just having a hard quarter and would do better. She'd written that down in her notebook too, like it was a real outcome. I kept my voice steady. Raymond didn't file this complaint because I harassed him. He filed it because I told his wife the truth about how he treats me, and now he's scared. Vincent looked at me a long moment. Then he he asked the question I knew was coming. If this had been going on for 2 years, why hadn't I escalated sooner? I didn't look at Vincent when I answered. I looked at Audrey. I did, twice. Ask her what happened. Audrey shifted in her chair. It was small, just a slight lean to the left, but in that little room with nowhere to go, it was the loudest thing she could have done. Vincent turned to her. Audrey, are there records of prior complaints filed by this employee? Audrey put her pen down on the table very carefully, like it was the only thing in the room she still had control over. There were 2 previous filings. Both were addressed through the standard process. What was the outcome? Raymond received a verbal warning after the first complaint. Both matters were considered resolved. Resolved, Vincent repeated. He said it like he was tasting something bad. He looked down at my stack of papers. Resolved for who? Audrey didn't answer. I walked out of that conference room and the hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed the same way they always did. Nothing looked different. But something had shifted inside that room that I'd never felt before in that building. Someone with authority had looked at my evidence and actually paid attention. Someone had asked Audrey why she let 2 complaints disappear, and Audrey had no answer. I went back to my desk and I sat there and I waited. Raymond's office door stayed closed all afternoon. Ruben texted me that night and said Raymond had been in there with the door shut for hours. And at one point he'd walked past and heard him on the phone with Lorraine again, almost yelling, saying this was all being blown out of proportion. The resolution meeting was Thursday. By then, Vincent had pulled Kirk back in with my timestamps on the table and asked him point blank whether he built those presentations or whether someone else did. Kirk couldn't keep the lie together with my emails sitting in front of him. He'd written a statement admitting Raymond told him to present my work because I wasn't right for the room, and that Raymond had threatened his promotion if he didn't back the complaint. Ruben had written his statement. Deborah had written hers. I walked into conference room B Thursday at 9. Vincent was at the head of the table with a thick folder. A woman from legal was beside him. Audrey was on the other side, hands folded, face blank. Raymond walked in 2 minutes late wearing a suit that had been pressed 3 times. He didn't look at me. He pulled out the seat across from Vincent and put on the reasonable face I'd seen 100 times. The misunderstood boss who just wanted to clear things up. Vincent didn't waste time. He opened his folder and said the formal review was complete, that his office had received written statements from multiple employees, reviewed document timestamps and version histories, examined existing HR records, and conducted interviews with both parties as well as supporting witnesses. His voice was even the whole time, like he was reading from a script he had gone over carefully, and I realized this meeting was not a discussion. It was a delivery. Whatever conclusion Vincent had reached, he had reached it before any of us sat down. He was here to say it out loud. He asked Raymond if he stood by his complaint. Raymond said absolutely. She targeted him. She dressed that way to provoke him. This was a pattern of inappropriate behavior on her part. Vincent nodded. Then he opened his folder and read Kirk's statement out loud. Every word. He read how Raymond had told Kirk to present my work because I wasn't right for the room. He read how Raymond had pressured Kirk to lie to HR and threatened his promotion. Raymond cut in, said Kirk was confused, that he'd been delegating based on workload. Vincent held up one hand and Raymond stopped. Vincent picked up Ruben's statement and read it. The break room. 8 months ago. The vending machine. Raymond telling me I needed all the help I could get. Then Deborah's. Confirming I had built the work presented under Kirk's name and hers. Then Vincent laid my email timestamps next to the shared drive access logs. The 2 sets of dates told the whole story without anyone needing to explain it. My files came first. Always. Weeks before the presentations. The evidence was right there on the table. Organized and clear and impossible to argue with. Raymond started talking faster, louder, words bumping into each other. He said it was a coordinated attack, that I'd turned his team against him, that he'd given 15 years to this company. He looked around the table for someone to agree. Nobody did. Vincent waited until he ran out of air. Then Vincent read from a printed page of the employee handbook. The definitions of retaliation, the definitions of obstruction, the definitions of a hostile work environment. He closed the handbook. The sound was quiet, just paper and cardboard. But in that room, it sounded like a door shutting. Audrey was looking at the table. I watched her hands fold and unfold in her lap, and I thought about the woman I had sat across from 2 years ago, who had told me she would look into it, who had told me Raymond was just having a hard quarter, who had let 2 complaints disappear into a file cabinet because that was easier than making a phone call. She did not look at me once. Revoking an employee's access to shared files the night you file a complaint against her constitutes retaliation. Directing colleagues to provide false statements constitutes obstruction. 2 years of documented appearance-based comments directed at a specific employee constitutes a hostile work environment. Your employment with this company is terminated effective immediately. You will be escorted from the building. The color left Raymond's face. He looked at Audrey. Audrey looked at the table. He looked at the woman from legal. She said nothing. And then Raymond looked at me. Actually looked at me. Not the version he'd built, but the person sitting across the room with the folder she'd carried in her lap like a shield. And this was the moment. Not the termination. Not the policy reading. Not even Kirk's statement or Ruben's words or the timestamps that proved everything I'd been saying for 2 years. This right here. Raymond looking at me and, for the first time, actually seeing me. Not the quiet girl who wasn't pretty enough for the front of the room. Not the invisible employee whose work he handed out like it belonged to everyone but her. Me. I held his gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him with the same calm, steady expression he used to wear when he sat on the edge of my desk and told me honesty shouldn't be punishable. I gave him that exact look, and I watched him feel what it was like to be on the other side of it. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without saying anything. I went back to my desk. My access to the shared drive had been restored. Every folder, every file, my name in the version history, my timestamps on the original uploads. I opened a blank document. I typed my name at the top. Below it, 2 words. Lead presenter. I saved the file. I drove home.